Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the Director of the Institute for Social Capital, and I'm also the current President of the International Social Capital Association. This session is hosted by ISCA, the International Social Capital Association, and it's really designed for researchers, and particularly those who are fairly new to social capital, although I suspect that any researcher would get quite a lot out of this kind of a session. And you might get some different perspectives and different ideas about the concept of social capital. And even if you're not a researcher, I still suspect you'll get quite a bit out of this, because I will be exploring what social capital is and giving a bit of an overview about the different meanings that the concept can have. And it is quite a complicated concept. So by way of overview, we'll start with getting started with social capital, what it is really about and what some of the key challenges are. And then I'll talk briefly about the value of the concept before moving on to trying to gain an understanding of what this concept of social capital is. And as I mentioned, there's a wide variety of different perspectives in the literature, has lots of different definitions. I'll talk about what the outcomes of social capital may be, because that can really help us to focus on what social capital actually is. And then I'll talk about what complicates the theory, because it is a very complicated theory, and people who are approaching it for the first time can get really lost in the literature. And there's quite a few challenges to reading the literature and conducting research on social capital. So I'll be running through this fairly fast. What I hope you'll gain from this session is that broad understanding of what the concept is and the different approaches that exist in the literature, so that you can quickly get into the theory and into the concept, and you can hopefully start using it in your research much, much faster than if you were just picking up papers and books and trying to make sense of this vast literature. You know, there's quite literally tens of thousands, maybe even by now hundreds of thousands of articles and books on the concept of social capital. So in terms of getting started with social capital, it's certainly a puzzling, cumbersome, intriguing concept. I've been doing this now for 20 years. I've been really passionate and fascinated with the concept for 2 decades. So it's complicated enough and intriguing enough to keep you going for a very long time. And really, I think the key message here about social capital is that social relationships are valuable and important. And of course, this is not a new or a novel idea. We all use social capital in our daily lives, our organizations, our governments. Everybody uses social capital, although we may not talk about it, use that term social capital. And certainly the idea of social relationships being valuable is often overlooked and undervalued in recent times. So the value then of the concept really is that it can highlight those social and cultural processes. You know, it can be corrective to those asocial ways of thinking about organizations and politics and media and education and so many other areas of modern life. And since the 1990s, this has sparked widespread interest. And certainly the popularity of the concept speaks to that perceived need and usefulness of the concept. And it's become so popular, it's one of the most commonly used concepts across the social sciences, right up there with concepts such as those really big and important concepts. So when we're digging into it, we need to appreciate that social capital has been approached from different disciplines, different levels of analysis, and applied to very, very different contexts and different problems. And therefore, there's lots of different meanings and different approaches. And this can be quite confusing when you're approaching it for the first time, and maybe even after trying to get into it for years. So reading the literature requires an understanding of these different conceptual approaches. And I'll give you some tools today about how you can navigate the literature and all of these different understandings that exist in the literature. And of course, the big issue is measurement. And it's an ongoing challenge, I think we would say. I did a survey of the literature a few years ago, and I found literally hundreds of different approaches to measuring social capital. So by no means has it been agreed upon. There is no one easy way to measure it. It really does depend on your research, your level of interest, your context, so many different things. And unfortunately, there's quite a bit of poor scholarship in the literature that can be challenging to try and work out what we should do and how we should design our research to be as effective as possible. So in terms of the value of the concept, I think it really is that it can communicate something that is often overlooked and undervalued from conventional analysis and reporting. And it's a part of a trend in recent decades to communicate these, maybe we could say, non-economic values as capital. So other examples being natural capital, human capital, intellectual capital, and there's a whole plethora of different capitals now. And other attempts not using the term capital might involve things like social impact or social value, or perhaps social investment or social return on investment. But more than just being able to communicate something, it's also a way for us to understand and improve practice as well. Social capital provides a framework for understanding what is valuable and important about social relationships and social behavior. And we can use that lens or that framework of social capital to influence behavior, to improve things, or to avoid costly and damaging social processes that might occur in our organizations or in our projects or whatever it may be. So it's a very valuable concept. And as I mentioned, there's so many people interested in it, is really demonstrating how valuable this concept can be. So I want to dig into what social capital actually is. And to do this, I want to step back a bit from specific definitions that exist in the literature, because there are so many. It can get really confusing and complicated if we're looking at individual definitions. So if we step back, we might be able to see the forest for the trees, as it were. So in terms of the actual meanings of these words, social and capital, social implies that it relates to interactions between people. So if we're looking at the micro level, that may be individual social relationships, but at the macro level, that may be the nature of social organization or social structure, perhaps. And social is a very broad term that can mean a lot of different things. Capital, on the other hand, involves some sort of a potential, an ability, a capacity. It's investment with an expectation of return. It permits increased production or outcomes in the future, and it can be maintained or depreciated or enhanced. And really, this is a fundamental characteristic of capital, is that it is a potential to do something. And we need to be really careful when we're designing research or we're understanding social capital, that social capital is not what it does. It is the potential to do things. And that's really important. I think we need to really stay focused on what that is. And if we take an example from other types of capital, then say, a bus is physical capital. The bus can transport people, but the transportation of people is not physical capital. The transportation of people is merely the service that the physical capital provides. So social capital, similarly, being capital, is a potential. It has the ability to provide something or do something in future. It's not going to be the mobilization of resources, for example. That is an outcome of the potential that is social capital. And I'll talk more about this, and we can dig into this logic of what social capital is. But before I do that, I want to talk about what social capital does. And in the literature, there's lots of commonly cited examples, such as cooperation, collective action, information flows, social introductions, social support, actions that are based on trust that perhaps result in reduced transaction costs, perhaps reciprocity, and various other types of giving and helping and caring type actions. These are the sorts of things that are commonly cited in the literature. So if we look for this list, what is the superordinate? What are all of these things examples of? And I think we could point to these things all being examples of social actions. Of course, that's a very broad term, and social capital as a potential, it perhaps facilitates or enables or encourages these types of social actions rather than there being a direct causal relationship, as there may be with other types of social phenomena. And I think we also need to not ignore those intrinsic outcomes that are associated with the potential for social action, such as psychological well-being or perhaps happiness, that are clearly these are important outcomes, but they're not action-based outcomes, as in the action doesn't need to necessarily occur for that outcome to be present. This idea of social actions, though, I explored it in a recent webinar because it's really quite complicated. What social actions could potentially encompass virtually everything that humans do. So can we start to narrow it down and identify certain types of actions that are the outcomes of social capital and perhaps those that are not? So in that webinar, I presented this kind of a schema of different modes of acting, such as actions with others, which would be things like collective action and coordinated action. And I think everybody would agree these are most definitely outcomes of social capital. Then if we move on to actions towards others directly, so these might be involving or impacting or relating to or accommodating others directly, including cooperation in the pursuit of others' goals, such as helping and sharing and giving and social introductions and so forth, not acting together necessarily, but acting or accommodating others' needs. Then I think most people would also agree this is most definitely an outcome of social capital. But where it starts to get a little bit more grey, we're not quite so certain whether these are outcomes of social capital, is those actions that relate to or affect others indirectly. So that might include actions relating to common property resources, or those actions that have externalities that impact others indirectly. Perhaps these are, perhaps these aren't. This is, I think, a matter for us to still try and decide and make sense of. And then there's actions that are influenced by others. So actions shaped by expectations, obligations, or the actions of others, but are not affecting or directly related to others. So examples here might be things like personal health and exercise actions, or the patterns of media consumption or educational choices. These actions don't directly affect other people, but they're still influenced by others. So there's certainly a fair portion of the literature that would suggest that these outcomes are the result of social capital, and I think it's interesting to explore those ideas further. So if we can try and make sense of what we've been talking about, we're talking about social capital is a form of capital, and therefore it is a potential. It's the result of an investment, or perhaps it's a byproduct of other activities. That's where it comes from. And that potential can provide some sort of future benefit or future return, can do something in future. So I think this is a really useful schema for understanding what the concept is and how we might go about separating its source and its outcomes from what social capital really is. But of course, there's still some really important questions here. What creates that potential? In fact, there's a lot of questions about what that potential actually is. And I think we've somewhat started to answer what those outcomes may be, at least in very broad terms, social action and those intrinsic outcomes that are associated with that potential. So the big question remains, and this is where there's a lot of different perspectives in the literature. And fundamentally, that question really is about, why do humans act cooperatively? What are the causes or sources? What is the influence of human action? So before I move on to exploring what that may be and what the literature says about that, I want to just expand a little bit more on this schema, because there's one piece of this source, form, and outcomes that I feel is currently missing. So we're saying it's an investment or a byproduct, creates a potential that facilitates the actions of individuals, that contributes towards some sort of future benefit or return. So to illustrate this, I've provided some examples here of what those actions may be. These were the ones that were on a previous slide. In terms of those overall outcomes, those future benefits, it may be things like innovation and creativity, resilience, reduced transaction costs. There's a whole list: public health, lower levels of crime, educational attainment, a whole range of different things that may be this future benefit or return that social capital may provide. And I put a little asterisk here because I think it's really important to acknowledge that within that context, many outcomes involve mobilizing or activating or enhancing or transforming other forms of capital. So as such, social capital is not a panacea, since it has limited capacity in the absence of other forms of capital, particularly human and physical capital. If other forms of capital are not available, then they cannot be mobilized, activated, enhanced, or transformed. And an example of this is that if no one in a village has a tractor, as in physical capital, then it cannot be loaned or borrowed or shared. So the context of what happens in the manifestation of social capital is extremely important. And this has encouraged quite a lot of scholars to focus on the idea of resources. Resources, of course, having lots of different meanings, that word having different meanings in the literature, but it is quite common to consider resources as part of or related to social capital in some way. And I think it's about a third of the literature is currently making reference to resources in some capacity. So I think that's a nice little schema for what social capital is and how it works, and it is consistent with the definition and meaning of what capital is. So if we think about the overall paradigm across all of the different approaches, different disciplines, different ways of understanding social capital, then perhaps we can start to identify what this potential is. What is the potential that produces those future benefits or returns? And as I said, there's lots of different ideas. Network configuration, for example, is one of them. And we can understand how the configuration of a network can represent a potential for future action, can encourage people to act in certain ways, provide the ability or opportunity for people to act socially with others, to share, to help, to care, all of those kinds of actions. So network configuration is, in the literature, one of those things that can produce the future benefits or returns. So I'm quite happy with that being there. It's absolutely true and correct. But other scholars focus on other things. For example, social norms. So social norms are, behavioral expectations of what is normal and appropriate in a given circumstance. And when people have strong social norms, then they're predisposed to act in certain ways. And if those predispositions, if those social norms are towards cooperation and collective action and helping and caring and all those sorts of things, and then we can build up that body of social norms that exists within a particular social grouping, and it represents a potential for social action that we can then get future benefits and returns. So yes, absolutely agree. And we could run through every single one of these. There's some ideas like brain chemistry, that when we act socially with others, we release hormones in our brain that gives us rewards, that makes us want to feel good and want to continue doing it. There's things like goodwill, that if we build up goodwill within a social grouping, or as an individual, I could build up goodwill, that is also a potential for future benefits and returns. Homophily, for example, this idea that when people are quite similar to each other, then they're far more likely to have social relationships, to help each other, to care for each other, to have a form of social identity, which is also in this list. So you'll see how it's got to be there somewhere. Social identity must be there somewhere. So you can see how, all of these different things are all different ideas and different approaches to understanding what social capital is. And I think in many ways, none of them are wrong. All of them are pretty much right. All of them have value. But it's not possible to be, I don't think it's possible to be completely comprehensive and try to account for all of these different reasons for human action, because then it's just too much and it's too big. But I think this kind of paradigm explains perhaps why there's so many different definitions and meanings to the term social capital. So moving on then, another thing is that social capital could be understood from different levels of interest. So for example, an individual can have social capital. For me personally, I could go out and meet people, develop those relationships. I could be trustworthy. I could do things for people and develop goodwill, develop a strong reputation. So it's possible to understand social capital from an individual perspective. It makes perfect sense. But we could also understand it from an organization's perspective. An organization can have social capital, and the factors that they're interested in would be a little different. So of course they would want people to know each other. They would want social relationships within the organization, but they would probably also be very interested in the social norms that exist, the social trust that exists, those wider, larger group factors that influence the nature of people's actions. And we can also think about it from the point of view of society, and the way in which the coordinating institutions and the rules and the laws and the enforcement of those laws, culture and religion and history, and all of these things can shape the nature of people's actions towards one another. So from each of these three perspectives, I talked about social capital in slightly different ways, but of course they're all related, because the individual is made up of, the organization is made up of individuals, the individuals make up society, and so on and so forth. So we need to take into account all of these perspectives depending on the application of social capital that we're taking. And this, again, is one of the reasons why there's so many different definitions and approaches and understandings of social capital in the literature. So I made a slide that tries to identify the sources of all of this complication. So level of interest, as I just talked about, is one of those. There is also the perspective of benefit, as who is actually going to benefit from this, whether it's a private good or a public good, or perhaps it's both. The actual methodological requirements of the researcher can play a role in what they think social capital is, how they define and conceptualize the concept. And of course, there's also different theories of human experience as well. So if you're focused on humans as self-interested, utility maximizing individuals, then your understanding of social capital may be different, or would be different, than if you considered humans as socially situated, or with a socially defined nature of their experience and therefore their actions. And perhaps it's instinctive, perhaps it's normatively defined by institutions. You can see how the theory of human experience can play a big role in what the definition and conceptual approaches of social capital are. So this slide is really just to give you a heads up to the sources of these different definitions and conceptual approaches. And certainly in the literature, there's been several attempts to categorize these conceptual approaches. And I've just given 4 different approaches here, or 4 different sets of categorizations that have been used in the past. I won't talk much more about these. You can dig into these if you're interested in seeing what they are and how they work. I'm going to actually give you a slightly different set of conceptual approaches that I think makes sense. And the way I came up with these was identified common themes that exist in the literature. In definitions and approaches to social capital, we see these themes: social networks, social structure and organization, trust, shared norms and sanctions, resources, benefits, cooperation. These are the sorts of things that come out. So if we look at what these things are, I think it's useful to talk about social networks and social structure as connectedness, how connected people are within a particular social grouping. Trustworthiness, social norms, perhaps that's about sociability, or I used the word before, predispositions, how people are inclined to act when they interact with other people. We have resources, which is just what it is. And then we have outcomes as well that are often listed specifically within definitions as well, things like benefits and cooperation that might occur. So using these 3, the connectedness, the sociability, and the resources, I've got 3 different conceptual approaches that I think exist within the literature. We have what I'd term the network approach, which looks specifically at the network and the social structures that exist. It's a very broad conceptual approach, the network approach. We have the resource approach, which looks at the network as well as the resources that are potentially available within that network. And certainly some of the key authors talk about those resources as wealth, power, influence, as well as some resources like information and material resources and money and so forth. And the meaning of the word resources in the literature is quite varied. And then the final approach, conceptual approach, is what you could call the normative, or perhaps the humanitarian approach, which looks at the social network and the connectedness, but also the nature of relationships, the norms, the trust, the goodwill, that exists between people as well. So these three conceptual approaches certainly don't take into account everything that exists in the literature. And the big absentee here, I think, is Pierre Bourdieu's approach, which is distinctly different than the other three. And then I think you've also what we'd have to describe as heterodox approaches, or just other approaches that don't fit neatly into any of the other four categories. So I want to quite quickly run through what each of these approaches are, and give you some key authors. If you're reading the literature, if you see these authors, there's a pretty good chance they're going to be writing from this particular conceptual perspective. And similarly, if you find these authors being cited, then again, you've got a fairly good chance it's going to be from this conceptual perspective. So the network approaches focuses on connections between individuals, their social network that produces benefits. And it focuses on the structure of the network. And it's not a single approach, but a variety of different but similar approaches. And you might see terms like mapping ties, identifying configurations, directionality, reciprocity, attributing qualities to social structure such as density, multiplexity, segregation, holes, structural holes, or leadership boundaries or bridges. These kinds of ideas, these kinds of concepts are quite common in the network approaches. Key authors being particularly Ronald Burt, Mark Granovetter, and of course the hundreds, if not even thousands, of scholars who have followed and continued this work. This particular conceptual approach has origins even going back before the concept of social capital, back to the probably 1960s and 1970s. So I'll run through these fairly quickly. I think they have value to get a quick overview or understanding of the difference, what each of these are. So the resource approach is resources mobilized through social networks, which is a pretty simple way of saying it. And at its heart, it was really a rebranding of social resource theory. Nan Lin published a book in 2001, which really was all about social resources and social capital. So for social resources, for Nan Lin at least, was the wealth, the status, the power, as well as the social ties of those persons who are directly and indirectly linked to the individual. Social resources make sense. But since Nan Lin, a lot of other scholars have added things like information, like even physical resources, a whole variety of different things under this label of resources that might be mobilized through social networks. And I think that's added quite a lot of confusion, honestly, to it. But this approach overall, I think, accounts for maybe as much as about 25% of the literature from what I've seen. Key author, absolutely Nan Lin. But again, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars who have continued that work. The next one, the normative approach. This is perhaps the most popular and most extensively used approach in the literature. And I think it's also the most broad. Generally speaking, from this point of view, social capital is the nature of social organization that influences positive or beneficial outcomes. So it tends to focus on that normative social structural arrangements that result from actors working together for mutual benefit. So it's norms that maintain and organize interactions between individuals. It's those values and beliefs. And it tends to focus on culture and socialization and the internalization of norms and values that then influence the nature of social action. The key authors here, certainly the early ones, were James Coleman and Bob Putnam, who are the two, probably two of the most famous and well-known authors on social capital. And I think, broadly speaking, at least, they fit within this conceptual approach. It's definitely important to talk about Pierre Bourdieu's approach to social capital, because for him, it enables a person to exert power on the group or individual who mobilizes the resources. So for Bourdieu, social capital is part of a well-developed theoretical project that sees capital as not only economic, and that social exchanges are not purely self-interested. So this idea of capital and profit in all their forms. And his work particularly focuses and emphasizes the structural constraints and the unequal access to institutional resources based on class and gender, race. And his approach is grounded in theories of social reproduction and symbolic power. And so for these reasons, it's really quite starkly different from any of the approaches that I mentioned before. Because it really is about social reproduction. It really is about class divisions and social inequities, and how some people can get access to resources because of their social position and status, where others cannot. And so for that reason, I see it as quite distinctly different. And the final catch-all box, which I've called just the heterodox approaches, really just acknowledges that there's a huge number of different approaches that don't fit into those other categories. And I've identified a few of them here. Adler and Kwong, which really define social capital as goodwill available to individuals and groups. Lyndon Robertson and co-authors who looked at it as sympathy towards another person. And then there's others, psychological states, perceptions, and behavioral expectations. So there's a very wide variety of heterodox approaches as well. But I think what we can see from all of these conceptual approaches is they still fit within that overall paradigm. They still see the social processes or some sort of social something that can provide a potential for future actions or future outcomes that may be beneficial. So when we're reading the literature, we need to be really mindful of these different meanings, conceptualizations, theoretical foundations, and methods that exist in the literature. And if we're not careful about identifying what conceptual approach is being used by an author, then we can find that it can be really confusing. And in fact, quite a lot of the literature is a bit confused. Scholars perhaps haven't been able to differentiate the different meanings of social capital, and sometimes have effectively mixed and matched and just borrowed bits and ideas from different places that don't necessarily fit well together. That can be a challenge because you're reading that in the literature, unfortunately. Many scholars have commented that tautologies can be found in some of the literature, and a tautology is simply a statement that is true by virtue of its logical form alone, and that's quite commonplace, unfortunately. And there have been over time some pretty wild and unjustified assumptions appearing within the literature. I sort of joke about the social capital literature being like the Wild West. There aren't a lot of rules about what you should and shouldn't do, and a lot of the criticism or critique of perhaps poor scholarship falls on deaf ears, partly because the literature is so vast and spread across virtually every different discipline and school of thought of the social sciences. And it's also to be mindful that different schools of thought can use different language to describe the same or perhaps similar ideas. So, for example, I'm not an economist, but in the literature, you might read economic type words like relational goods and attachment value, commodities, exchange, consumption, these kinds of words. When you actually dig into what these words mean, quite often they're very much the same or very similar to the ideas that sociologists might use, just framed within a different context, using different kind of language. But when you have these sort of challenges, that's why I developed these tools, the logic schema, the paradigm outline, and the conceptual approaches diagram to help you to navigate through the complicated literature. So the slides that I included in this presentation, which I'll make available afterwards, such as the schema, can be useful. The paradigm diagram that shows all these different ideas of what the potential may be that exist in the literature may be useful. And of course, the conceptual approaches diagram as well may be useful to navigate your way through the literature. So we're coming towards the end, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So if you're conducting research on social capital, and I think it's absolutely essential that you narrow in on a definition and conceptual approach that is suitable for your research, that makes sense for your context, that makes sense for your school of thought and the way you think about the nature of human action, And that can take a little bit of time, and you might need to read quite widely before you can settle in on exactly what that is. But I do believe it's essential to define that really carefully and clearly so that you don't have to deal with the huge different number of approaches that exist in the literature, which can be really challenging to navigate. And that's the point, really. If you don't do that, then when you're doing a literature review, you'll have to try and filter out the thousands, tens of thousands of articles on the concept that may be from a very different meaning, very different conceptual approach. Then, of course, when it comes to measurement, there's lots of different methods, and it really has to come down to what your context is, what your definition is, what you're saying social capital actually is. And still, after 35, 40 years of research on social capital, there's no commonly agreed way of measuring social capital. There's no blueprint for it. It's always a challenge when people ask me, well, how do I measure it? I then have to say, well, what is your definition? What is, I need to get into it. What is your context? And then we can get to a point where we can identify the way to measure it. There are ways to measure it. It has been measured thousands, tens of thousands of times, so it is possible to do, but sometimes it can be perhaps a bit intangible or a bit dynamic, depending on what the meaning of social capital is for you. And I think just about everybody agrees that it's multidimensional, and you need to incorporate those multiple dimensions into your measurement approach. Of course, there's always in research challenges of data availability and challenges of data collection. If you're doing a large-scale project, say at a community or societal level, then data can be extremely challenging to get. Even if you're collecting data at a lower level, a smaller level, say just on an organization or a particular social grouping, there still can be challenges, because people don't necessarily know what they think. They aren't necessarily able to communicate their thoughts about trust or norms or goodwill, depending, of course, on how you're defining social capital. But of course, that can be a challenge for data collection as well. I've written lots of articles on these kinds of issues, and there's about 6 or 7 webinars that I've given in the last couple of years as well that explore many of these kinds of issues. So you might like to look further at those in a bit more detail. So in terms of getting further support, joining the International Social Capital Association, if you haven't already, is a great way to do that. And ISCA has a lot of free events, PhD sessions from time to time, regular discussion groups, research design and methods workshops specifically designed for social capital, webinars, networking events, that kind of thing. And also the Institute for Social Capital has 200 or so different articles that dig into all of these issues about dimensions and measurement and levels and all that kind of stuff. And we also have some online courses available as well, just for a small fee if you want to really dig into more of what social capital is from a research point of view. So I'll stop the recording there. That's the end of the presentation component.